Hello, I'm Imacuttlefish aka Baker here, about to talk about another character from the main cast in Endwalker. The topic of today's video is none other than the grumpy yet badass jumpy boy of the group. Now, Estinien is absolutely a fan favorite and it's not hard to see why. He feels the badass/cool character archetype, which tends to be popular characters because, shockingly, it seems that people like cool shit. Just consider other similar archetypes from the series like Vincent from Final Fantasy VII, who even got his own spin-off game, or Auron from FF10, where people even to this date keep begging for an FF10 prequel just to get to see more of him. But of course there is more to Estinien than that, and so we are going to talk about some of those things today. What better place to start than with backstory? I should begin by mentioning that Estinien is a character originating from the 1.0 version of the game. However, in contrast to characters such as Minfilia or Gaius, his involvement in that game is more or less irrelevant. This is because the Dragoon questline from 1.0 was copy-pasted to 2.0 with only minor changes. So you get his backstory in the Dragoon questline for A Realm Reborn. In that storyline, you find out that Estinien was born in a small Ishgardian village named Ferndale, which got razed by one of Nidhogg's attacks 2 decades ago. He lost his entire family, and a deep desire to exact revenge motivated him to join the Order of the Knights Dragoon, a small and elite unit within the Temple Knights in Ishgard that specializes in destroying dragons with awesome firepower and acrobatic maneuvers. He was quite successful and eventually became the Azure Dragoon, who acts as the acting commander of said unit. He became one through the same right that his predecessors did, being chosen by the Eye, granting him powers far beyond that of mortal men, trained by the previous Azure Dragoon. That's really all we know for the most part of his backstory. His parents and younger brother got clapped by Nidhogg, and the man has been on a path of vengeance for the last 20 years of his 32-year-long life. However, something interesting to note about Estinien's upbringing and adult life is its sheer contrast to the rest of the main cast in Endwalker. When you compare these characters to Estinien, what is the main thing that stands out to you? That would indeed be everyone else's ties to Sharlayan, where Estinien has none. This is a rather interesting juxtaposition because Sharlayan is obviously a nation that is very fond of their anti-war rhetoric, whereas Ishgard couldn't be any more the exact opposite, it being a nation plagued by a never-ending 1,000-year-long war. Now, obviously not all of these characters had ties to Sharlayan initially. Some were born in other parts of the world, some even into the Sharlayan colony in the Dravanian hinterlands rather than the motherland, but my point remains that at some point in their lives, they became associated with Sharlayan and have been associated with them for a very extensive period of time before the game begins. On top of this, Sharlayan as a nation is way more scholastic and sophisticated than Ishgard. So what we have with Estinien is a man who has been living in a country that has been under a perpetual state of alert and warfare for as long as he has lived. I guess it's a hard point to convey, but it is quite different growing up in a country that is at war. It has a certain type of gravitas to it. Now, on top of this, Estinien is also a highly accomplished career soldier. He is essentially the real-world equivalent of having someone join the Navy SEALs, and not just that, but also becoming a commander. I want to bring up this contrast that Estinien has compared to the other characters in the main cast because it's going to be important at certain points, so please keep this thought at the back of your head throughout this video. The first time you canonically encounter Estinien is in the Dragoon questline in A Realm Reborn. He's this Dragoon who has gone rogue, and you find out his backstory and his motivations. Nidhogg is about to awaken, and Estinien reckons Ishgard is in danger. He assumes that the worm is after the Eye, so he plans on luring him away from the city, not just to prevent casualties, but to fulfill his personal ambition, which we learn of for the first time. His desire to exact vengeance upon the worm that murdered his family. When Estinien meets the Warrior of Light, the Eye reacts to them because, of course it does. You are super awesome after all, and most importantly, the protagonist. The eye refers to one of the eyes that Haldreth, the first Azure Dragoon, gouged out from Nidhogg in their first and only encounter. The right eye remained on the Dragoon himself, but the left eye was used as a relic to serve as the source of the Azure Dragoon's powers across generations, as a Great Worm's eye contains incredible might. In this context, it is used by a very specific Dragoon, chosen by the eye, which then empowers them and grants them draconic powers, allowing them to smite down their enemies with capabilities that far outshine any regular pleb. However, the Azure Dragoon also has to take great care so that they won't be consumed by the eye, as the dragon spirit lives inside it and it is always trying to consume its user should they falter for only a moment or become lost with their emotions. As Estinien notes, people cannot really comprehend how the eye operates, and it works in mysterious ways. Normally, only a single person gets chosen at a time. However, this time it chose the Warrior of Light after having already chosen Estinien. This is unprecedented, as this is the first time it has ever happened. Estinien thinks that two Azure Dragoons existing at once is a sign that they are fated to go slay Nidhogg. Although, whether he really thought that is debatable. It could also very well be that he just saw an opportunity, an easy outing, to further justify/rationalize his desire to kill the worm. The Warrior of Light is trained by the former Azure Dragoon Alberic, and they eventually manage to fully attune to their Song of the Dragoon, but Estinien sees the events of his village burning through the eye and becomes bitter towards his former mentor for his inability to prevent it. This really puts him on the edge, feeling like he has lost a great deal of trust, and swears to kill Alberic and the Warrior of Light both, stating that there can only be a single Azure Dragoon. He gets his ass handed to him by the Warrior of Light, but as a last resort, he calls out to Nidhogg to consume him to give him power, but this too doesn't work out, as the Warrior of Light projects the OG Azure Dragoon through them and claps Estinien. Here we already see one of Estinien's personality traits. You can end up losing his respect quite easily, and if you do, he treats you in pretty low regard, such as what happened with Alberic here. You could say that he detests cowardice in specific, but I think it's more to do with his own principles. Once you don't act in accordance to his own principles, he doesn't think all that highly of you. One could also say he's very judgmental, particularly at this point in time. The next time you meet him is in 2.5. Honestly, he isn't too involved here, and I wouldn't blame you if you forgot he actually appears in a Realm Reborn outside the Dragoon job quests. He's basically just another dude helping defend Ishgard. However, the meeting with Aymeric and his brief appearance after clearing the Steps of Fate are still important. For players who didn't do the Dragoon questline, it serves as our introduction to Estinien and briefly explains the Eye, what it means to be an Azure Dragoon, and a bit about Nidhogg. For those that did do the Dragoon questline, in addition to the prior things mentioned, it shows that Estinien has overcome the madness trip he took at the end of the level 50 job quest and doesn't want to throw hands with the Warrior of Light anymore. It's interesting that him going rogue in the Dragoon questline and then showing up here as if nothing happened is kinda glossed over. I wonder if it's because the Dragoon questline was leftovers from 1.0 and they sorta struggled to tie it in with Heavensward. One can of course infer that he was always sanctioned by Ishgard to go on that mission, or that he was forgiven for going rogue because of it benefiting Ishgard by driving away the Dread Worm, though we are never given an answer to it one way or the other. Anyway, the second encounter with him, after defeating Bishop, is also important for those who didn't do the Dragoon quest, because in it we see his desire to slay Nidhogg and thus better understand his motives when we start Heavensward. Estinien joins us quite early into the Heavensward story, as an unlikely alliance forms between four individuals to find peace between the Ishgardians and the Dravanians. A vaunted warrior exiled Heavensward, a young diplomat from a foreign nation betrayed by loyal hands looking to redeem himself, a Hydaelyn's chosen branded as a heretic, fighting for a false cause born out of desperation, and a vengeful dragon knight hell-bent on slaying the worm that took everything from him. The journey between the Warrior of Light Alphinaud, Eorzea and Estinien is a big portion of the Heavensward story, and it's a segment that many people are quite fond of. In fact, even after all the stories that came since, this part still stands out to many people as one of the best parts of FF14, and I definitely see why. Much of it is used to not just progress the plot, but also to flesh out all the aforementioned characters. We get to see the personalities of these characters come to the forefront and their own values. They grow from the ordeal through introspection and by getting exposed to the ideals of their allies. It is very much reminiscent of the type of journeys you went on in some of the older mainline Final Fantasy titles, where you get to really bond with a small amount of party members and learn of their struggles and really connect with them. I already talked about this journey from Alphinaud's perspective in my previous video, but there is an interesting relationship going on between Estinien and Eorzea as well. At the start, these two hate each other to the point that in more or less every scene where these two interact, they are bickering with one another. This contempt, of course, comes from their differing mindsets. A good example is the scene just before the party enters Som Al. Estinien is eager to forge ahead. Eorzea then informs Estinien that the defenses will be formidable and that they'd surely cross Dielman, a dragon close to Nidhogg who protects Som Al from trespassers. Estinien reaffirms her that there is nothing to be afraid of and that he will cut down the dragon should they try to stop them. This angers Eorzea, who reminds Estinien that they are here to parley with the dragons, not to slaughter them. Estinien fires back by reminding her that he joined to attempt a peace with Racevelger, specifically that destroying such a dangerous dragon such as Dielman would help Ishgard, which in his eyes is the ultimate goal here. This causes even further contempt within Eorzea, who sees Estinien as a bloodthirsty butcher beyond redemption. This scene, and quite a few other scenes where they interact, perfectly encapsulates the two characters. Estinien is pragmatic and blunt. He often resorts to violence as the first option. This serves as a perfect counterbalance to Eorzea, who tries to generally be more compassionate and advocates for ending this war by achieving peace between mankind and dragon, just as Saint Shiva had done ages ago. In the campfire scene, we see both of them reflect on themselves through Alphinaud. Eorzea shows regret at the suffering that she's caused in her pursuit of peace while being driven by her perceived truth, while Estinien reflects on his inability to see the dragons as anything but the enemy. But in the end, they both carry a ton of conviction for their chosen course. This scene is important because it is the first time that we get to see the two start to think about the world a bit more outside of their own narrow viewpoints. Thus do they slowly come to respect one another and even learn from each other. Up until a certain point, both Eorzea and Estinien wear a sort of a mask, trying to hide whom they really are from each other. Both of them use the pretense of doing this for Ishgard and to end the war and all that, but they are both driven by much more selfish desires. Now, these desires are definitely something that we can sympathize with, but still, it bears mentioning how they were attempting to hide it under this pretense, and yeah, it's only once these masks start showing cracks and are eventually shattered that they start to truly appreciate each other, gain mutual admiration, and call each other allies. Estinien claims to have joined so that in the event that peace isn't attainable, he would buy the Ishgardians time to shore up their defenses after the sabotage from Iceheart's forces as well as the recent Horde attack. However, as I said, this is him wearing a mask. His sole desire is to have this be his revenge-fueled trip. He basically pretends to act in Ishgard's best interests, but his true motivation is rather selfish. It's just that his desire to clap Nidhogg happens to serve Ishgard as well. Then you have Eorzea, who pretends to be Saint Shiva and, like her, bring peace between man and dragon, and in the process, expose the corruption of the Holy See. But it was all something born out of desperation and loneliness. But once again, this happens to align with their goal for now. For them, claiming they are doing it to end the Dragonsong War is simply a way to justify their crusade, not just to those around them, but more importantly, to themselves. It's a very compelling part of Heavensward, watching both of these characters' masks slowly start to shatter as they come to realize why they themselves are doing this and what it was all along that drove them. Not these grand ambitions of ending a 1,000-year war, but rather their own desires. For Eorzea, this moment is when you meet Reisvelger, who had named her an imposter and a fool. Needless to say, this completely destroyed her, as it basically spat on everything she had believed in for most of her life.
'Twas my life's goal to slay Nidhogg, but I find there is little joy to be had in its accomplishment.
But you have rid the world of a hate-filled creature, and ended a bloody war in so doing.
I lost my family to Nidhogg's flames, and 'twas with fury in my heart that I took up the lance. Every blow I struck in the name of vengeance. We were not so different, he and I.
I will not judge you for your deeds. I have not the right. Too many innocents have perished in the name of my greater good.
For Estinien, this moment came when he at last defeated Nidhogg, only to realize there was no satisfaction. Eorzea even asks if he doesn't feel good about ending the Dragonsong war. Estinien came to realize that he was no different from the worm that he loathed, seeing as his sole motivation for doing the things he had done was to exact revenge and nothing else. For Eorzea, it took her a while to pick herself back up after Reisvelger revealed the truth about the primal Shiva to her, but she eventually comes around, not by begging for forgiveness but by atoning for her actions. She implores Reisvelger to help her aid the warrior flight and the others in stopping Thordan. Reisvelger sees the merit in this, maybe at some level even respects her, and flies her to Azure where, well, you know what happened. I do want to discuss Eorzea's death scene here a bit because I've seen some people who say that her death didn't have enough impact. The most common criticism is that in contrast to Harshaphon, the characters didn't stop to mourn her enough and just forgot about her after a while. The thing is, unlike Harshaphon's death, the situation was quite urgent. There wasn't much time to stop to grieve when there's this big-ass Imperial ship trying to tear you to shreds while Crazy Pope is trying to fulfill his scheme of becoming God King and rule the world. Now, Estinien does only say,
"Fare you well, my lady."
But what you have to keep in mind is that Estinien isn't that great at conveying his emotions. We see that in the Dragoon questline where he loses it so much that the eye takes a hold of him, and we see it again here. Like, this is actually one of his character traits if you stop to pay attention, and I'll mention some more examples of this later down the line. But my point is, even though he's unable to convey his emotions to its fullest extent here, we do see what he thought of Eorzea more or less through his actions later on, which in my opinion is a much smarter way to demonstrate it than have 5 minutes of drama during a high-intensity situation. But most importantly, I think people who claim her death wasn't meaningful enough fail to see the bigger picture. Though it would eventually be us triumphing at Sorkai that finally convinces Reisvelger to believe in mankind again, this act by Eorzea here was the crucial first step towards achieving that, as Estinien later points out.
And yet, were the chasm between us too vast and too deep, Reisvelger would not have borne his sail to battle and our rescue. He would never have entrusted a mortal champion with one of his eyes, and the Dragonsong war would still rage on. And I would still wage a never-ending war of violence and vengeance. The future of our star be damned.
Emphasis on first line. Also, Reisvelger mentions it himself in the side story. My point here is that no, Eorzea did not die in vain, because her death was significant. Now, as for Estinien, he realized after killing Nidhogg that without this desire for vengeance, his life was really quite hollow and devoid of meaning. Blood for blood, pain for pain. He never thought of theirs, only his own, because nothing else mattered. But it was only after the deed was done that he realized how similar he was to his mortal enemy. He was able to stare into the face of his foe and see himself in him. This then causes him to slowly start to change, most of it happening off-screen between 3.3 and 6.0. What I like is that he doesn't immediately start this change because there are more urgent things going on. They first get called back to Ishgard, and they have to stop Thornton's schemes, in so doing figuring out what happened to Nidhogg's right eye, and then he gets possessed by Nidhogg, meaning his change really only starts happening way later. So in a nutshell, I love the dynamic between Estinien and Nuzeil. You have these two characters who are two sides of the same coin, who had very similar circumstances that led them to do what they did. They were both orphans, felt a strong conviction to do something about the bad hand they were dealt as children. They initially clashed with their own ideals, but later came to truly respect one another as comrades and learn from the other, and they were both instrumental in bringing an end to the Dragonsong War. Usail, through her conviction towards attaining peace between dragon and man, which resulted in making that first step towards rekindling Hraesvelgr's faith towards mankind that saved the warrior flight in their battle against Nidhogg, and Estinien's conviction to defeat Nidhogg. Though the foundation for both of these convictions came from a misguided and selfish origin, they nonetheless developed into something selfless and something more resembling heroic. Of course, there were other major characters in Heavensward that Estinien interacts with, Aymeric and Alphinaud being among them. I'll discuss Alphinaud later, but on the topic of Aymeric, we see how there is this huge amount of mutual respect between these two men.
You shall have my blade as well. There are more of these mana cutters to be had, yes?
Lord Commander, no!
How can I, a proud knight of Ishgard, stand by and do naught while an outsider risks life and limb for our homeland? I swore an oath to protect this city.
Pray leave the slaying of dragons to dragoons, Sir Knight. Your duty to command the city's defense is no less vital. Should we fail, and Nidhogg slip through our grasp, who then will hold the walls against him? Will you leave Ishgard in the hands of the Holy Sea's zealots?
There are others.
Who but you has the authority and the standing to orchestrate a city-wide defense? I do not, and neither does the Warrior of Light. That is why it is our place to fight, and yours to remain here, Lord Commander.
This is established right away, first with Estinien being shown as a close ally to Aymeric in 2.5 and then in 3.0, with Estinien complimenting Aymeric's leadership qualities, stating he'd prefer him to be in charge over those zealots. I also love how quickly he is to defend Aymeric even when he isn't there, when the topic of him being Thornton's bastard is brought up.
If the rumors regarding his heritage are to be believed, we have naught to fear.
Lies and slander. Bastard or trueborn, he is our nation's best hope. If the Holy See dares to threaten him, I shall lead the charge against the Vault myself.
He's basically the type of friend who would immediately dispel any nonsense about you if someone was speaking shit behind your back. And then of course him going to Aymeric's aid so readily. Now, you do learn through one of the side stories that there's an additional layer here, which is that Estinien feels gratitude towards Aymeric for saving him from becoming a dragon's meal when he was still just a grunt. But I like that even without this bit of knowledge, we really see through Estinien's actions just how much he respects Aymeric. On the topic of 3.3, I kinda skipped ahead, but at the end of Heavensward 3.0, he faltered for a bit and got consumed by Nidhogg's unbridled rage. Luckily, we are able to form a friendship with Hraesvelgr, who grants us his eye to give us a chance to fight Nidhogg's shade. As the fight progresses, the Dreadworm curses his brood brother, and eventually he reaches the point of absolute desperation, no longer caring about causing endless torment but rather to simply raze everything to the ground before he meets his end. It's an extremely tough battle, but we make good use of the eye and almost defeat the Dreadworm's shade, who holds on to life to the bitter end.
I would ask one last favor of you, Warrior of Light. Finish me, now, while I have the beast subdued! You waste your time. Kill me! It is the only way! Ending Nidhogg will be my final duty! No! You can't die like this! I won't let you!
Estinien being suicidal here is really sad, because I like to think he's not saying that just because he thinks Nidhogg cannot be killed otherwise. When you think about Estinien's existence, how revenge was all that motivated him all this time, he has nothing else to live for. It makes a lot of sense that he doesn't care that he himself dies, as long as his adversary dies with him. This was definitely Estinien's darkest hour in all of his life, and we see him reflect on it in the infirmary sometime after. This is where Estinien comes to truly appreciate life, probably for the first time within the last 20 years, because he had people who cared about him, and in turn he came to realize that he has the capability to do more than be consumed by his hatred for the dragonkind, to not end up like Nidhogg, to not be poisoned by the desire to avenge.
It was the very image of my own heart. There I saw the dark reflection of the hatred I felt after Nidhogg slew my family. When no path remained save vengeance against dragonkind. Neither one of us had a choice. But I was blessed with something Nidhogg was not. Comrades and teachers to console and admonish me. Had I not had them to gainsay my obsession, it would surely have consumed me as Nidhogg's did him, and we would have been in all respects alike. Though his shade is banished, his spirit scattered upon the sea of clouds, I feel no joy at his passing. Where once I craved vengeance, I now crave rest.
Alright, that'll conclude part 1 of the Estinien analysis. The reason this comes in 2 parts is because I am changing how I approach making content a little bit. I realized that especially my last 2 videos are hard to approach for a lot of people due to their excessive length. This wasn't really by purpose, it just so happened that the topics I wanted to cover required going through them that extensively. However, I don't want people to be scared away from my content when they see those 2 to 3 hour long videos. The reason for this sort of length is because of my mindset when it comes to creating content. I want to be as thorough as I possibly can, so whenever I cover a topic, I really want to go deep into it. But not only does it make my content more difficult to approach, it also makes it harder for me to make content, because sometimes a video could be taking 2, 3, 4 times as long as another video because of the sheer amount of stuff to discuss. So from this point onward, I will be trying to make my videos fit within a certain range when it comes to length, so that I won't end up being burned out and can have a nice routine when it comes to making a video, allowing a more consistent upload schedule, as well as making it easier to approach. So in this instance, I had the choice between making a well over an hour long video talking about Estinien in full, or I could do 2 parts. I feel like it makes sense to do one video on Heavensward, which focuses on his journey until 3.3, then we can all be on the same page when I go into part 2, where I will cover some of the side stories he features in after 3.3, and I will talk about his role in the FF14 story more in detail. My next video will be on Xenos, as there was a lot of interest for it, and then I will finish my Estinien analysis in part 2 after that, and I will try to cover more Endwalker topics as we go along. Till then, have a nice day.